This is Common Ground with Sonja Wolf. With me today to talk about the immigration experiences of Central American mothers is Susan Terrio. Susan Terrio is an anthropologist and professor emerita at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. She has authored a number of books and conducted research in immigration courts and federal facilities for minors across the United States. And she has also served as a volunteer in private immigration detention centers in Texas and Georgia. Welcome to the podcast, Susan.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So we're going to touch on one of the books you have written, which is titled Forced Out, Migrant Mothers in Search of Refuge and Hope. This is a book that you worked on before Donald Trump came into the White House for a second time. Perhaps to remind the audience what it is that the second Trump administration proposes to do in terms of immigration, which is one issue that figures very prominently on President Trump's agenda. So some of the measures we might mention concern the migrant protection protocols that the administration wants to restart. There's also a hotline for people to inform the government about immigrants involved in crimes. The government wants to revoke temporary protected status for Venezuelans, suspend or restrict the entry of immigrants who pose a public health risk. The administration also has begun to deploy troops to help secure the southern border, and it wants to expand immigration detention facilities. So the list really is very long. I just wanted to mention this at the beginning to get us started when we think about the experiences of Central American mothers in the United States. Susan, could you tell us how you came to write the book?
I will be glad to. But first of all, let me add one other policy of the second Trump administration that is particularly alarming, and that was their decision to suspend all refugee admissions. As you know, every president, when they enter office, is able to set the number of refugees who are vetted outside of the country for long periods of time and then enter legally. And the second Trump administration has effectively shut down that entire program. So let me answer your question. I had already written 2 books on the challenges that undocumented children and families face before I embarked on this book, and I'll explain how that came to be. So in 2017, I attended a conference at the University of the District of Columbia Law School where there was a specific panel on the challenges that these mothers who were coming across the border without inspection or without documentation with young children that they were facing, because as soon as they crossed the border, they were apprehended and taken to for-profit immigration prisons, as you mentioned, in Texas. So in this particular panel, 2 immigration attorneys described the horrific obstacles that the women faced. And one story haunted me particularly. It was the story of a young mother. She was not incarcerated in Texas. She was held at a repurposed nursing home in Pennsylvania and had a 5-year-old who got very sick and was spitting up blood for days before the detention staff made any move to allow her to seek treatment. She was ultimately taken to a local emergency room. I was so horrified at that and responded to the attorney's plea for volunteers to travel to Texas and to get trained as immigration legal assistants. And that is what I did in 2017 and 2018. So I got inside those prisons, but I also got a very clear picture of the particular challenges and the things that these women were leaving behind. They were fleeing for their lives and coming with very young children to the United States. And so it was at that point, because I had seen what happened to them after they crossed and were apprehended. And many of them at that point spent long periods of time in immigration prisons. But my impetus at that point was trying to understand what happened to the women who were not apprehended at the border, and if they got across what is a very militarized border, how did they manage? Did they connect with family? What did they do for work? Where did they live? And how did they deal with their children? So that was the beginning of the book.
The book is based on interviews with a number of women, and as one reads the book, the picture that one gets is of tremendous challenges in the countries of origin, but also as the women make their way to the United States, and of course, as they try to make a life for themselves in the United States. Individuals who participate in this kind of research, therefore, face already certain struggles, but they might also be concerned about perhaps exposing themselves by participating in this research. So why did the mothers decide to tell their stories?
That's a great question. And let me just set the context. So I returned from doing that volunteer work at the prisons in 2017, 2018, determined to find mothers who would be willing to describe what happened to them and how they were dealing with life in the United States. That was a very challenging task to identify the mothers. And I was lucky enough to connect with a Nicaraguan. She was an advocate, but also employed by the local school district. And by virtue of her participation in a parent reunification program, was able to speak to these mothers who knew her and trusted her and ask them if they would be willing for me to meet with them. Now, remember, this was 2017, 2018, and there were a lot of immigration enforcement initiatives that we had not seen in either in Northern Virginia or Southern Maryland. And my home university is in the District of Columbia. So we had to, rely on people who were known and trusted by the local immigration community. And I was frankly really astonished, given the immigration raids that were occurring and the arrests that were happening outside of schools and churches, et cetera. Their primary motivation was to inform other people, to let other people know the challenges that they faced and what other people would need to know about surviving in the United States, taking care of their children, and working.
Let's turn for a moment to Central America. All the women that you interviewed left a country in Central America. Could you explain a little bit the profile of the mothers who participated in your research? What were the circumstances in Central America that they left behind?
So all of the mothers in my research sample were from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And most of them were very young when they'd had their children. They had little or no education. And in fact, several of the mothers were in fact illiterate. And they faced horrific violence, either at home from intimate partners or fathers or siblings, or in their communities from criminal elements, from gangs and drug cartels. So they had very young children, and all of them at the time when they determined that they had to leave were either single, trying to get away from abusive partners, or widowed. And the other thing that was really important to know about them is that they were largely raising children without any financial or social support from their partners. And as I said, they'd experienced domestic violence at home, or were threatened in their neighborhoods by gangs or drug cartels or corrupt officials, people in the school district that they should have been able to trust, or people in the local municipal government. So in many cases, the way they described their decision to flee was to save themselves and their children. It was a matter of survival. They felt that they had no choice but to leave.
By the time you met the mothers, they had escaped detention and settled in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. You explained that only one of the mothers got legal status through her daughter. This is a woman you call Teresa. Could you share with us her story? How is it that this woman came to have legal status in the United States?
Okay, fine. But for one clarification, only one of the mothers in my sample had been detained and released from prison. All of the others got across the border without having any interactions with immigration enforcement. I think it's needless to say, I had to change all of the real names and identifying characteristics of the women for their own protection, and because they had only agreed to be interviewed because they were promised confidentiality. Teresa's story was particularly interesting because she'd been stalked and essentially coerced into having sex with the school principal, the principal of her public school, when he was 41 and she was 15. She got pregnant and had a child by that man. And when he continued to stalk her, she left her child with her grandparents, and through horrific circumstances, being injured, trying to get across the border, ultimately getting across the border, and then arriving in Fairfax County, Virginia. And I have to say that they have a very enlightened policy in that public school system of Fairfax County because of these family reunification programs, and because of the support that they provide through immigrant liaison personnel in every single school of the school district. So her daughter by this time was in elementary school, and unbeknownst to Teresa at the time, she had been abused by her stepfather. Teresa had married and had a second child by a man she thought was a pillar of her community. He was a very active member of the church. And this is so interesting because she only realized, she knew instinctively that it was so wrong for him to come into her room at night after her mother was working the night shift. But she didn't understand what was happening until she attended a sex education class, and the teacher explained what sexual abuse was and that it was against the law in the United States. So because of this wonderful liaison in her public school, she explained what was happening. And because of the rules in Fairfax County, they immediately contacted local law enforcement. And there is a special non-immigrant visa called a U visa that is available to immigrants without legal status, but who cooperate with local law enforcement to bring to justice someone who's accused of a serious crime. And this was a long, long story, but that woman was instrumental in helping Teresa's family, at that point 2 children, find another apartment, stay in the same school, arrange for busing, and more importantly, get a pro bono attorney who helped her get through, first of all, the legal proceedings in the local family court, and then apply in the immigration court for this special visa. And because she'd been so cooperative, she did ultimately get this visa. And the main benefit, of course, is your ability to apply for U.S. citizenship, which she was able to do. But that she was an outlier in terms of the sample. She was the only one who had that kind of advantage.
Let's return for a moment to Central America. You already painted a picture for us of the mother circumstances in their countries of origin. And often we find when women reach the United States, it is because they are fleeing domestic violence or gang violence. So I wanted to ask you if you could go a little bit more into why the women thought they had to flee their countries in order to escape these forms of violence, why they thought they couldn't rely on the justice system in their countries.
That's a great question. So yes, it was very interesting to me when I asked them that same question, and they either scoffed or laughed and said it was common knowledge, and in their own experience, they knew that they could not rely on local law enforcement. If they went to the police and explained that they were being abused, The police often told them to go home and have sex and make up with their abusive partners because they couldn't do anything for them. And there was another instance, I don't talk about this in the book, but when I was doing the interviews in the immigration prisons, um, one one woman explained that she and her husband had been targeted by the gangs because they had witnessed a murder, and she went to a local prosecutor in the town and explained what she had seen and wanted to bring the gang to justice. And the prosecutor just looked at her and said, "There's nothing I can do for you. Go home and pray." And that, I think, is emblematic of the realistic assessment that women make of the situation. There are laws that have been implemented or voted, one should say, in these countries, but that are never really enforced. And the other thing that can happen is that a woman may courageously decide to go to local law enforcement and try and get help. And if in the rare cases when local law enforcement does agree to help, what they will say to the women is, "Well, okay, we'll go out and investigate, but you'll have to put gas in my car, or you will have to pay for my lunch." So it's a really fatally compromised system, and it's riddled with corruption. And I think that the women's personal experience and also what they know about their neighborhoods make it impossible for them to get protection. And that's why they feel that they have no choice but to leave their countries or go to another town. I mean, if you're asking for asylum in the United States, one of the things you have to prove if you allege that you're in fear of persecution is that because of persecution in a particular place, you have tried to go to another town or another location, and then that has to prove to be untenable. So they were very well aware of what the options were, and they couldn't rely on public officials, law enforcement, judges, or prosecutors.
Like many unauthorized migrants, the Central American mothers also traveled to Mexico, made a clandestine journey before they eventually reached the United States. What was this journey like for them? What were the risks? And did they encounter any supports?
It was a very difficult and dangerous journey through Mexico because of, the threats not only from cartels and gangs, but also from corrupt customs officials or military police. And there is generalized violence in that part of the world, as we know, armed criminal groups, the official corruption between and the active collusion of people who represent the state and these criminal groups. And gender-based violence has soared, including rising rates of femicide. And so these women, and many of them did have smugglers who often abandoned them. They carried cash in their shoes or sewn into their clothing. They witnessed or survived robberies. They fell victim to attacks, sexual assaults. They had to outrun or hide from federal police. And one case in particular, Maria, she and her 2 children took them 6 months to get to the U.S. border because they were living literally hand to mouth. They were sleeping outside, sleeping on plastic bags, rummaging through garbage because they had no money. I mean, it's an incredibly dangerous and fraught journey. It can be facilitated by smugglers, but even then, there remain very many risks. And the case of Teresa, when she was going through the Sonoran Desert, she had initially a coyote, a smuggler, but she was abandoned in the desert by that man because she couldn't keep up. She had shattered her ankle, months before. So, I mean, it's the environment, it's the climate, and it's all of the threats that these women faced from the people they encountered.
You just mentioned the smugglers, which are people that many migrants rely on as they try to transit Mexico. I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more detail when it comes to the smugglers, because this figure of the smuggler has also changed over time. Yeah. And of course, as you mentioned, there is widespread violence in Mexico, and the routes that migrants are taking go through territories that are controlled by criminal groups. So who are the coyotes or the smugglers, and what is their relationship to the criminal groups in Mexico?
That's a great question. And, I was surprised because of the media reports that I had read. In almost all of the cases when the mothers and or their children were connected with coyotes, they were all known to the families in the towns where they came from. So the figure of the coyote as, a heartless predator, yes, of course, they're very interested in the money and they make good money. But it is in the smuggler's best interest to keep people alive and to get them to their destination so that they can collect on the money. But it absolutely is a much more complicated picture. In many cases, the smugglers were really kind to the women and or their children. They came through. They followed through on their promises. They made sure they had food. They made sure they had, to the extent that they could, reliable transportation. The problem was, and this is what you alluded to in the second part of your question, over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a restructuring of illicit smuggling. It's a much more vertically integrated and centralized operation with really powerful, large criminal organizations at the very top. And the case of Isabel is illuminating in that regard because, it's an astounding story. She ultimately married the smuggler who helped her get to the United States, but he was, like many others, an independent contractor. He worked with an American boss who got people across the border, but he set his own rates. He determined the routes. He arranged for safe houses. And realistically, he had to negotiate with corrupt officials. He had to pay the bribes, and sometimes he had to run drugs. There was a lot of negotiation that went on between the smugglers, the large-scale criminal organizations, in the process of getting people through these very dangerous territories. And the thing that I tried to emphasize based on all of the testimonies that I got, or particularly the small-scale independent smugglers, were themselves pretty vulnerable. They didn't have the resources. They could only resist the larger criminal organizations to a certain extent. And in the case of Isabel, her husband, who I call Miguel, after they got married, and she begged him to get out of the smuggling business because it was very, very dangerous. He eventually was killed by a rival smuggler, and it may have been another small entrepreneur like him, and they were directly competing for the traffic through certain territories. But it's not just the image of a ruthless and violent predator. It was in there, as I said earlier, it was in their best interest to ensure that the people that they took money from got to their destinations, because the fees were paid in increments. So in order to get the final increment, they had to get people across the border alive.
Isabel's story is indeed striking, and perhaps you could share with us also what happened to her in El Salvador, her country of origin, because Isabel is someone who went to the United States more than once. So she returned because she wanted to be with her dying mother. And there were more developments in El Salvador, which prompted her ultimately to return to the United States. And I think what happened in El Salvador also sets the stage for what we're going to talk about later on when we touch on the initiative that Fairfax County has to assist immigrant families.
Exactly. It's really an extraordinary story because she was, as I said, initially approached by Miguel, who was known to all of the local families, including her family. he was sort of amazed at her physical prowess and attempted to ingratiate himself with her family, particularly her mother, who was very sick with uterine cancer at that point. And he successfully ingratiated himself and proved himself worthy of both of her parents. And then he realized how badly she wanted to go to the United States because both her father and several of her older siblings had temporary protected status because of an enormous earthquake that had occurred in El Salvador. So that meant they could go back and forth legally. They could work legally in the United States. So, and he knew how devoted she was to her mother. Her mother's illness got so grave, and to pay for the blood transfusions that she needed to stay alive, they were indebted. They had to incur. Her father had to incur huge debts on the land that he bought, ironically, with the money he made in the United States. So there was this question of the debt. Would they be able to hold on to their family patrimony? So Miguel offered to help her, and he did. He got her a cross, and then, ironically, as she was just arriving in the United States, she heard that they had taken her mother back to El Salvador. I mean, they were honest people. Her visa was about to run out, and so they took her back, and she was in a very grave state. And when the news got to Isabel that her mother was literally dying in a hospital after all she had gone through to get to the United States, she just packed a bag and got on a plane and went home in very short order. Her mother died. And then her father, as she told it, was so bereft at losing his wife that he committed suicide. And she was left alone to manage this farm because her father and her older siblings were still in the United States. And at that point, one of her friends, Rodrigo, who helped her with the farm, then they became romantically involved, and she became pregnant and had his child. And then following that, he became involved in one of the gangs. She also had a relationship with Rodrigo, the father. So they lost touch. He stopped being involved, and he never recognized his son, who was also named Rodrigo. She had a relationship with a local migrant a local native who was much younger. And I mean, so she had to hide that because there was a social sanction against having a romantic involvement with someone who was younger. And he stayed home and did the cooking and changed the diapers. I mean, there were some very amusing parts to this story. But anyhow, so he went to the United States to work, and they lost contact, and he stopped sending money. But this is the part of the story that you're particularly interested in. So she was managing the farm. She has hired workers. It's a fairly going concern, and they're in town waiting to get food at a local restaurant, and a gang comes through. And this is, at a period of time when gangs were exploding in El Salvador. They were all over, including in their small town. And so there's a fuselage of, bullets. Rodrigo, the son, his father is injured, and we find out later dies. So because of, the involvement of the gang, they imagine that because this Rodrigo has a son, that the son is a threat to the gang. And they send gang members out to her farm to assault her. And she escapes the assault, but then realizes that she will not be safe, even though she had the semi-protection of the mayor, who agreed to write an affidavit that she took with her when she left with the children. But that was, a really very, very sad development. And as she said, when she finally got to the border with the two children, she said, I wasn't taking those kids through the desert. So she took a bus and ended up being, apprehended by Border Patrol. And I mean, the interesting thing was that occurred in 2014. And anyone who's been following immigration knows that there was a huge influx of not only unaccompanied minors, but also families and mothers with young children. And the Obama administration had opened these expanded for-profit immigration prisons. And there was such chaos at that point because at one time, 500 migrants a day were coming across the border. So she could very well have been separated from her children and the kids put in federal custody. But she escaped that and was able to get to Fairfax County, where she enrolled both kids in school. But, and this is the very sad part of it, the son, Rodrigo, was so traumatized by the journey through Mexico and what he had witnessed in their hometown that initially he did all right in school. And there are very good English as second language programs in Fairfax County. But he happened to be in a very large school. And there are different cliques. There is bullying that goes on. And he felt targeted. He felt like no one liked him, and he began to act out violently. And there is absolutely no tolerance for that in this particular school district. And the long story short is that he ultimately was suspended from school and told that he could only come back if he got mental health services. But what Isabel never did was fully explain to the school, and perhaps it's understandable because it was very painful, that he probably had PTSD. He was suffering from, all of the trauma that he had internalized. And so all he wanted to do was go back home. And this is years later. So she had a brother who was managing the farm back there, but she was torn between trying to protect him and her daughter, her younger daughter, and then dealing with the ramifications of his possibly being expelled from school, not being able to return to school. And then, should she send him back to be with, his uncle on the farm? Because he was, apparently a simple kid. He didn't want to get an education. All he wanted to do was work. So that situation exemplifies many of the tensions and impossible choices that people have to make. And it was a very sad story.
We're going to look more closely now at the experiences of the mothers in the United States. And I'd like to begin with immigration detention. We mentioned at the beginning of the episode that you have not only conducted research about detention, but you have actually seen detention facilities, different kinds, public and private. And I'd like to ask you about immigration detention by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and the Border Patrol. They're all part of the Department of Homeland Security. What can you tell us about the conditions in which migrants are being held, and how are people treated in detention facilities?
Well, first of all, the most important thing to know about this is that they are for-profit prisons. There is the Bureau of Federal Prison, which governs state and local federal, state, and local prisons. And there are very strict guidelines for how these prisons should be run, how people should be treated when they're incarcerated. No such federal oversight exists for immigration prisons. And that's one of the first problems. They are inhumane. There are very harsh, first of all, because they're for-profit prisons, the water that detainees have access to is barely potable. And when I was a volunteer in the two Texas prisons, they told us as legal assistants and volunteers not to drink the water because it was too dangerous. And that was the only water that people inside the prison had. And all of the interviews that I was able to do later in the Georgia prisons, I was conducting those interviews in French because they had a lot of West African people, in addition to people from the Northern Triangle countries, who complained bitterly about the food. It was, riddled with worms. It was insufficient. And it was so bad that many people in those prisons have to buy food from the commissary at inflated prices. But more than that, it was the requirement to work. In some prisons, Yes, you could refuse to work, but then you were subject to sanctions. If you worked, you got $1 a day, or in some places, no money at all. So they were cooking the food, they were cleaning, and the thing that a number of people complained about were the arbitrary punishments. For instance, and this is an example from Teresa's experience. She was the only one who was in an ICE detention facility. She had been, as I said, she'd been hurt, and when Border Patrol saved her life when she was abandoned in the desert. They took her to a hospital. Of course, they shackled her to the bed, and when she was deemed well enough to leave the hospital, she was transferred to this ICE detention facility. And when she got there, no one explained what the rules were, and she saw someone from home, from El Salvador, and ran to hug that person and was immediately slapped with the sanction of punishment. She was sent to solitary confinement for a number of hours. And she didn't know what she'd done. She didn't understand what the rules were. No one had told her. The rule was you can't touch another detainee. But more than that, everyone that I talked to who was able to speak about what they'd experienced said that the guards were frequently verbally abusive, using racist slurs. They didn't give any information. And one of the most difficult things that detainees experienced was, unlike, a penal sentence, in the immigration system, there is no definite end to incarceration. No one will tell you when you are eligible to be released. It could be months, it could be years. And one of the African, he was Cameroonian, people that I spoke to when I was a visitation volunteer at one of the prisons in Georgia, in the Stewart detention facility, I said, well, how long have you been here? And he said, I've been here a year, and I have no idea when I'm going to be released. And he had passed a credible fear interview. That was one of our tasks when we were legal assistants in the Texas prisons. We were to meet with the mothers and try and help them prepare for their credible fear interview, which is the first step in the asylum process. It was the lack of information and the uncertainty, the unpredictability, combined with the harsh treatment from guards. And one thing that happened in the Texas prison that I'll never forget, while we were interviewing the mothers, their children, there was a playroom that was set off to one side, and the kids would have to go in there, because no one wanted these kids to hear what their mothers had experienced. So, and often the interviews would last an hour or an hour and a half. And one little boy got really upset because we were interviewing in rooms when we had the door closed, and he didn't know where his mother was. And he got very upset and started to cry. And one of the guards picked him up and said, "Boys, don't cry," and put him down without really reassuring him in any way, shape, or form. So it's the whole oppressive nature of the system, from the bad treatment to the inedible food to the, undrinkable water, that is really, and woefully inadequate medical attention. There was very little attention. Even when people had serious medical issues, I started the story, started to talk about that young girl in the Pennsylvania detention center. They didn't have adequate medical personnel, and a very neglectful policy toward really addressing serious medical issues.
A moment ago, you mentioned the credible fear interview, which is part of the asylum process. So I wanted to turn a little bit to the intricacies of the asylum process. We know that President Trump, in both his administrations, tries to discourage not only unauthorized immigration, but he also wants to reduce the number of asylum claims that are presented in the United States. Take us a little bit through the asylum process and the hurdles that individuals encounter when they're trying to claim asylum in the United States.
Well, the most significant hurdle is that the entire immigration system in this country is deemed a civil system. And that means that there is no funded legal representation for people who are apprehended and placed into deportation. They're called removal proceedings. They do have the right to have their case heard by an immigration judge, but they don't have the right to have legal representation. And anyone who's familiar with immigration law knows how complicated it is and how much it has changed and how not impossible, how very, very difficult it is to appear before an immigration judge and a government prosecutor without legal representation and then be successful in an asylum claim. Because to win asylum, you have to show that you have been persecuted or have a well-founded fear of persecution based on one or more of 5 protected grounds: race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. As I said, the other thing that's so disturbing about this situation, this system, is that the due process protections that you have in this country when you are in a penal proceeding do not apply. It is basically the government prosecutors who establish the facts of the case. And that's very different from a penal system where there's a back and forth between the prosecuting attorney and a defense attorney. You have a situation where people have been traumatized. They may not have any written records. They only have to establish their credibility. And if if it's been months or years since you experienced persecution, and because of the trauma, you may not be able to remember specific details or, the kinds of things that would be convincing to an immigration judge. It's very difficult to gain legal status. And the thing that was disturbing during this period when these women, who for the most part had been victims of gang persecution, had been victims of domestic violence. And one of the first things in the first Trump administration one other thing. So this system is not in the judiciary branch of our government. It is in the executive branch, and immigration judges are under the authority of the attorney general. So they're in a very strange position because they're asked to give independent judgments of cases that are brought by their boss, the attorney general. And they are not Article III courts. So the same due process protections do not apply. And the power largely resides with the government attorneys and immigration judges to a lesser degree. So that when the Attorney General Sessions in the first Trump administration changed the rules, and he has the ability to do, the chief immigration judge has the ability, the Attorney General has the ability to change the criteria for obtaining asylum, and particularly in that last category, membership in a social group. So he issued an order that said basically people who had prevailed on the basis of gang threats or domestic violence abuse, that was no longer a valid claim for an asylum petition. Now, the Biden administration, when the Attorney General Merrick Garland came in, he immediately reversed that decision by Attorney General Sessions. But now we're in a second Trump administration where those kinds of protections have been eviscerated. It's far worse now than in the first Trump administration.
You just alluded to the hurdles that individuals face when they go to the immigration court. It is well known that the immigration courts face a huge backlog. So even if individuals manage to present an asylum claim, many years can go by until they receive a decision in their asylum case. And in the meantime, they are free to live and work in the United States.
Yeah.
And this is what I would like to turn to now. So individuals who don't yet have legal status, who have a pending asylum claim, what is life for them like in the United States? What sort of new challenges do they face? What kind of adjustments do they need to make?
Well, I mean, there are two ways of looking at this. People who advocate for immigrant rights say that, yes, it's a distressing situation to face an enormous backlog. And there are now 3.6 million cases in that backlog. There has been a shortage of immigration judges, has been a problem for adequate training of immigration judges. And now the second Trump administration has just fired a number of immigration judges. However, because they do have the ability to stay here until their claim is adjudicated, and they do have permission to work. Some people say that yes, it's a disturbing liminal position to be in, but on the other hand, it would give them, their children at least, if they have children here, the opportunity to go to school, to learn English, to become more assimilated in American life. Obviously, always with the Damocles sword waiting over their head of the final decision. And it does. Being in an intermediary position like that is very stressful. But I think having the ability to stay here for a decent amount of time and to work cannot be totally negative.
Let's go a little bit more into the relationship also between, in this case, the mothers who participated in your research and their children. So, of course, there are challenges for the adults, but also the relationship between the mothers or the parents and their children goes through different phases, also encounters situations that perhaps they hadn't expected when they left their country of origin. So how is the relationship between the parents and their children also affected by their arrival in the United States?
It's very, very problematic in many, many cases. First of all, because all but two of the mothers left their children behind, either with their mothers or an older sibling, because of the militarized border and the danger in getting across. So in almost every case, the mothers thought that they would work a couple of years and then have the money to hire a smuggler to get their kids over the border. And ultimately that did happen. But in almost every case, it was years and years, 8, 9, 10 years before they had the wherewithal, the financial capacity to bring their children over. And, they always, in the case of these mothers, they sent money back, they sent food, they sent clothing. They tried to, support their families as best they could while living in the United States. However, the kids were very resentful. That not only did they miss their mothers and wanted their mothers there and insisted that they didn't care about the material goods and the money they sent back, they wanted their mothers with them. And for their mother's part, they felt that they endured enormous sacrifices and were living, in overcrowded houses, working 2 or 3 jobs. And they were ironically the same kinds of jobs that they were doing in the home country. They were working in restaurants, washing dishes. They were caring for kids. They were cleaning. And so there was really there was a total misunderstanding in many cases of what their mothers the challenges their mothers had to face and the kids. So what was particularly painful for the mothers was to realize how angry and resentful their children were. And in many cases, because it was so difficult for them to get enrolled in school, to learn English, to try and wrap their heads around, a school system that was completely different, and in many cases much more demanding than the schools that they may have attended in Central America or Mexico. So the family reunification and parent classes that I attended were really interesting because it showed those conflicts. It showed the mother's hurt and their attempt to, convince their kids that what they wanted for them was their well-being and their success. They wanted them to succeed in schools. On the other hand, the kids often, not always, but often felt that they couldn't measure up. It was too hard to learn English and then perform adequately in school. And, you didn't mention this in your question, but one of the most painful experiences I had as an interviewer was with the mother whose name I called her Vanya, and her daughter was Giselle. That was an interview that lasted for much of the afternoon, but because it was so painful for everyone, I didn't go back and try and interview that woman. When we arrived with my Nicaraguan colleague, the daughter was locked in a room. She came out very reluctantly. And in the process, we heard the total family story. This young woman had been born, she was a US citizen, but because her mother, again, had an abusive partner and biological father, she couldn't work and do everything she needed to do, to put food on the table and take care of her daughter. So she sent her daughter back to El Salvador at that point. And so the daughter spent many, many years in El Salvador with her grandmother. But when the mother finally thought that it was time, she brought her older daughter over and then wanted Giselle to come. Giselle did not want to come. And when she came, she was desperately unhappy. And in that interview, she cried and, she expressed, she was acting out in ways that, were, they would leave food all over. She wouldn't talk to her mother. Whenever her mother, came back, she would go in a room and close the door. I mean, it was a totally acrimonious and really, really tragic situation. And the end of that interview was, well, her grandmother wants her to go back to, El Salvador. And of course, they were all worried about the gang presence at that time. And the last comment that the mother said was, well, if I send her back, she will win. I will lose this argument. And what I want for her is to succeed in this country. So it was that was really, really sad. But it encapsulated the impossible situations that the parents were in, having sacrificed, having given up so much for their kids, getting them across finally and incurring tremendous smuggling debts, and then have their children be furious with them and resentful and just, resistant. That was hard to hear.
I think many, if not all, of the stories you share in your book are difficult. And I'd like to invite you to share one more story of a woman you call Maria from El Salvador. And you met her at the time when her husband had been deported twice, and he was hiding at the time you conducted the interview. And I think this is a very telling story when we think about why individuals often get deported from the United States and what it does to the families, because then we see families being split up. So what is the story of Maria?
Maria's story was, again, interesting, but extremely sad. So she'd been abandoned by her husband, and she had, a toddler, and she tried to get across the border on her own because he had abandoned her. He was with another woman at that point. So she went ahead, and the story of getting to the border, she had help from a local prominent personality and one of her schoolmates who traveled to the U.S. border with her, posing as her husband. And at that point, her schoolmate and the smuggler that they had hired, who got them successfully to the U.S. border, they had to return to El Salvador. So at that point, she had to make the agonizing decision whether she would try and carry this kid on her shoulders across the Rio Grande River, whether she would give the baby along with the baby's birth certificate to an American she was the boss, and have the American pose as her grandmother. Long story short, she had to give the baby to this American who was, a smuggler boss. She didn't really know her at all. They got across. She was ultimately reunited with her daughter, and the daughter was safe, although she hadn't been well taken care of in the interim. So they get to the U.S., and she has the possibility of being well cared for by one of her father's aunts. But this is the pull and tug. she was with that woman for a month. That woman wanted to help her, get her in school, take care of the baby. But her husband reached out to her and he knew that she was in the United States. He wanted to come too. He apologized. He said, he was sorry for the abandonment, but he wanted to come and renew their relationship and convinced her to go with some of his relatives who were in Virginia at the time. So she gave up this wonderful situation she had in Houston, Texas, and went to Virginia, where she was really badly treated by her husband's relatives. Ultimately, he did get across. They had several more children. He built a very successful business. But this was a period of time when it was really difficult to be an undocumented immigrant. So he was arrested because of a broken taillight on his car, and because I'm sure he had brown skin, and local law enforcement arrested him and saw, because he'd been deported once before, that he had an outstanding deportation order. And so that scene where her one of her children was begging ICE officials to let him go and let him come back with his family didn't work. He was deported. She incurred a lot of debt because she had an unscrupulous, probably not an attorney, but a notario. And they are not recognized or credentialed legal experts or legal representatives in this country. So he was deported. He eventually, as you said, got back across the border, but was living in the shadows and was not able. I mean, they had a very successful business that just, they had to abandon because there was no way for him to do that work and come out of the shadows. What I did not have a chance to explain very fully in the book is that her son, who was very angry because of his father's situation, really had a lot of problems with the school district. And in fact, he was at risk for becoming a juvenile delinquent because of the way he was acting out. So she had so many challenges, and it was unclear to what extent she'd been able to surmount them and be able to stay in the country with any kind of sense of security. So that was a very challenging situation.
Earlier in the podcast, you mentioned the parenting classes. So I'd like to turn now to the program that exists in Fairfax County for members of the audience who are not familiar with the Fairfax County School District. Could you explain, first of all, a little bit the characteristics of the school district and what is this program about that the district or the county has for resettled refugees and undocumented families?
Right. I mean, it is really a model program in the country because it's a very large school district and the population is very diverse. There are many, many different nationalities that come to that part of Northern Virginia. And so I think many, many years ago, the people in charge of the school district saw that it would be to their advantage as well as to the advantage of the children and the parents to have classes that allowed families who, didn't speak English, didn't understand anything about American schools, about how to build a life in the United States, what the requirements are, how you have to be educationally successful. So they had a very enlightened attitude. They hired what they called immigration liaisons and put one in every single school. So when people came to the county and wanted to enroll their school, and by the way, it's important to remind viewers, because of a Supreme Court decision in 1983, Plyler versus Doe, it is absolutely legal for any child, regardless of legal status, to enroll and stay in a public school until grade 12, until the last grade. So they made sure that there were people who met these families, who helped them get their children enrolled, who told them about what services they may or may not be eligible for, and then in some cases helped connect them to pro bono attorneys if they needed to try and get legal status. So they had parent projects, what are called family reunification classes, exactly for the kinds of challenges that I described between Vanya and Giselle. to point out that, it was a very difficult decision that they'd made. They'd been through a difficult period in their lives. They needed help and support, and they needed to know how to succeed. They also, as I said earlier, they have a very excellent English as a second language program, so that they made sure that the kids were in those classes, and when they graduated from them, had counseling and continued support. So it really was a model program. I think it originated in California, but it was a very successful program. And unfortunately, I live in Georgia now, so I'm not sure what has happened, because it relied on funding sources to hire and all of those liaisons that I mentioned. They were all immigrants themselves. They had legal status, but they'd had the experience of migrating to the United States, and they had children in the school district, so they understood very well what they needed the parents to know, and help them, reach their goals.
For many years, the United States has responded to undocumented migration by focusing on detention and deportation. What sort of alternative responses to undocumented immigration would you propose?
Well, unfortunately, it's a very drastic situation in this country right now. In the book, I had a series of conclusions. I talked most specifically about what they needed to do with the immigration court system. More judges, more funded legal representation. The immigration judges that I talked to all said, this system would be so much fairer and so much more efficient if everyone, particularly children under 18, had legal representation. It would be better for everyone, because the reality is, as time has gone on, that system has become much more punitive. Although it's nominally a civil system, it has many aspects that are much closer to a penal system, but without any of the protections that people who are accused of crimes in the United States encounter. Well, the other thing I suggested was regarding asylum. It looks like asylum is dead at this point. Not only are there no refugee admissions that are permitted, but they've basically shut down the asylum system in this country. So, it's a very, very depressing time. There's really not much I can say. And I mean, we're even having vital data sets controlled by the government completely erased. It's a very, very challenging situation. It's hard to know what direction to go in, because, as you mentioned at the outset, immigration detention facilities are being vastly expanded with his mass deportation programs. I have to say, it's just incredibly dispiriting. And I'm not very optimistic about the situation. Now, I will just add, here in Georgia, I'm part of a legal aid organization for immigrant rights. And one of the things that we're working on is letting immigrants know what rights they do have under the U.S. Constitution. They have the right to remain silent, the right not to open their doors if immigration comes pounding, except if they're presented with a signed judicial warrant. We are trying to solicit donations for legal representation, for food pantries, clothing, other kinds of material support. But I'm sorry to sound so dismal. There just aren't very, very many options that appear good at this point.
As you just mentioned, the specific recommendations or ideas you put forward perhaps assume goodwill on the part of politicians in the United States, particularly the executive and members of Congress. So these are difficult times to work on immigration reform. I'd like to put perhaps a final point to you. When we think about the possibility of ending immigration detention or ways of reducing immigration restrictions. Immigration detention is profitable. This is the point you mentioned earlier on. And often the centers, the detention facilities are located in very remote areas, in towns that seem to depend on the jobs that immigration detention creates. On the other hand, immigration restrictions are supported by many people because they go hand in hand with racism and with anti-immigrant narratives in the United States. So I would like to invite a final reflection from you about the politics of this. For those who would like to see immigration reform in the United States, what might be some of the ways of countering the vested interests that help to maintain or even boost immigration detention in the United States, and how might the anti-immigrant narratives in the United States be countered when they are so powerful for politicians?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is remind ourselves that before this administration came to power for the past 10, 15 years, my husband and I lived in the Washington, D.C. area for 30 years. And when we looked around, the major sources of labor for construction, for agriculture, for childcare, for painting homes, etc., it was all immigrant labor. People should just stop and think a minute before they end all legal avenues for, or think about reinstituting visas that allow people who are coming from other countries to maybe go back and forth to do seasonal work. They're already experiencing incredible shortages in cultivation and in harvesting fruits and vegetables in California. This nation works on immigrant labor. They're an incredibly vital part of our community. And if there were legal status or new visas introduced to allow them to be here legally, they already pay taxes and they get no benefit from it. We would all be better off if they were in safe and comfortable communities contributing. The other thing that is really, really important is the situation of DACA, kids who have deferred action for child arrivals. This was a benefit that was created under the first Obama administration. It is not legal status, but it is a decision to not deport young people when they were brought to this country as young people and are for all intents and purposes Americans because they've been educated in American schools and speak English. That program should be expanded and not threatened with elimination as the Trump administration has done. The other thing that would help immensely is to end, the Biden administration said that they were going to end for-profit prisons. Well, they did that, except that ruling didn't cover immigration prisons. So for-profit prisons are just an abysmal way to deal with a population of people who in many instances are very vulnerable. They just want a decent life. They want to, work. They want to take care of their children. So I'm sorry, I can't be more optimistic. So legal representation, providing many more visa opportunities. I mean, we basically have family reunification, ties to an employer, and humanitarian possibilities. Those are the three legal avenues. We need to revamp our entire immigration system, create more visas, create more possibilities that will allow people, to come here legally and go home for periods of time if they want to, without encountering a militarized border.
Thank you, Susan, for sitting down with me to talk about the immigration experiences of Central American mothers. That was Susan Terrio, anthropologist, here with me on Common Ground. I'm Sonja Wolf. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Sonja. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about my book. Thank you.